In the summer of 1892, three African-American men named Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart made a decision that would forever change the course of American history. They opened a small grocery store in Memphis, Tennessee, believing in the promise that hard work and entrepreneurship could lead to prosperity. Their store, the People's Grocery Company, quickly became successful, drawing customers away from a competing white-owned establishment across the street. What happened next would expose the true face of domestic terrorism that had been lurking in America's shadows for decades. On March 9, 1892, a confrontation erupted between the competing store owners when Moss, McDowell, and Stewart defended their property against an armed white mob. They were arrested and thrown into jail. 3 nights later, under cover of darkness, masked men broke into the Memphis jail. They dragged the 3 businessmen to a field outside the city limits and executed them in cold blood. Their crime? Success while black in America. This brutal murder would ignite the fury of a young journalist named Ida B. Wells, whose investigation into this lynching would unveil a systematic campaign of racial terrorism that had been terrorizing African Americans across the South. What Wells discovered was not isolated incidents of frontier justice, but rather a coordinated network of white supremacist organizations, led by the most notorious terrorist group in American history, the Ku Klux Klan. The statistics are staggering and paint a picture of domestic terrorism that rivaled any foreign threat America has ever faced. Between 1877 and 1950, more than 4,000 documented racial terror lynchings occurred across the United States. Recent research has revealed the true scope was even larger, with nearly 6,500 lynchings documented between 1865 and 1950. These numbers represent only the cases that were recorded, and historians believe the actual toll was significantly higher, with countless murders going undocumented in remote areas where terror reigned supreme. The geographical distribution of these lynchings tells its own horrifying story. Mississippi led the nation with 581 recorded lynchings, followed by Georgia with 531 and Texas with 493. These were not random acts of violence, but calculated campaigns designed to maintain white supremacy through fear, intimidation, and murder. Every hanging tree, every bridge, every courthouse square where these atrocities occurred became a monument to America's original sin. The Ku Klux Klan emerged from the ashes of the Confederacy like a malevolent specter. Born in the small town of Pulaski, Tennessee, in December 1865. Just 9 months after Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, 6 young ex-Confederate soldiers gathered in a law office to form what they initially called a social club. The name itself revealed their intentions, derived from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle, combined with an alliterative version of clan. The Ku Klux Klan represented a circle of brotherhood united by hatred and violence. What began as a social organization quickly transformed into something far more sinister. With the passage of the Military Reconstruction Acts in March 1867 and the prospect of formerly enslaved people voting in the South, the Klan evolved into a political terrorist organization. Their mission was clear: to restore white supremacy through any means necessary, including torture, murder, and psychological warfare. Contrary to popular misconceptions that paint the Klan as a fringe group of poor white outcasts, the organization drew its membership from every level of Southern society. Planters, lawyers, merchants, ministers, and respected community leaders donned the white robes and participated in acts of unspeakable brutality. This broad social support gave the Klan a legitimacy and protection that allowed their reign of terror to flourish unchecked. The Klan's organizational structure resembled a military hierarchy, with sophisticated command chains that coordinated terror campaigns across multiple states. By 1870, the Ku Klux Klan had established branches in nearly every Southern state, creating a network of domestic terrorists that operated with impunity under the protection of local law enforcement and political leaders who were often members themselves. The methods employed by KKK lynchers were deliberately calculated to maximize terror and social control. Their arsenal of horror included hangings, floggings, mutilations, tarring and feathering, kidnappings, and brandings with acid. They introduced the now infamous tactic of cross-burning, transforming a Christian symbol into an instrument of intimidation that would strike fear into the hearts of African American communities for generations. The Klan's violence extended far beyond individual murders. They systematically burned black schools and churches, viewing education and faith as threats to white supremacy. They intimidated black and Republican voters, often arriving at polling places in full regalia to ensure that democracy itself would be corrupted by their presence. Women and children were not spared from their brutality, as the Klan understood that terrorizing entire families would maximize their psychological impact. Perhaps most chilling was the Klan's use of psychological warfare. Members often wore ghoulish disguises and committed their crimes under cover of darkness, appearing like supernatural entities to terrorize their victims. They would sometimes claim to be the spirits of dead Confederate soldiers, exploiting religious beliefs and superstitions to amplify the fear they instilled in their targets. The planning and execution of KKK lynchings revealed the premeditated nature of these acts of domestic terrorism. Rather than spontaneous outbursts of mob violence, lynchings were often planned days in advance, with careful consideration given to timing, location, and method. Local law enforcement frequently provided support or simply looked the other way, creating an environment where terrorists could operate with complete impunity. What made these lynchings particularly horrifying was their transformation into public spectacles that drew thousands of spectators. These were not secretive acts of violence committed in remote locations, but rather carnival-like events that attracted entire communities. White newspapers would advertise upcoming lynchings like entertainment events, vendors would sell food and souvenirs, and professional photographers would document the proceedings to create postcards that were sold as macabre mementos. These spectacles served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. They were deliberate acts of terrorism designed to send a clear message to the African American community. This is what happens to those who dare to challenge white supremacy. The public nature of these events normalized extreme violence and demonstrated the complicity of entire white communities in maintaining racial hierarchies through terror. The attendance at these lynchings often numbered in the thousands, with families bringing children to witness the torture and murder of human beings. Elected officials, prominent citizens, and community leaders would gather to participate in or observe these atrocities, lending them an air of legitimacy that made resistance seem impossible. The victims of these public lynchings became grotesque trophies in a ritualized celebration of white supremacy. After the torture and murder were complete, crowds would surge forward to claim pieces of the victim's clothing, fragments of the rope, or even body parts as souvenirs. Fingers, toes, and other remains were distributed among spectators like sacred relics, carried home to be displayed as symbols of racial dominance. Professional photographers capitalized on these atrocities, setting up equipment to capture the final moments of victims' lives and the jubilant faces of their killers. These images were then mass-produced as postcards, sold in general stores and distributed through the mail system. Families would pose smiling beside mutilated corpses. Children would be held up to get better views of the carnage, and the photographs would be sent to friends and relatives with casual messages scrawled on the back. One such postcard from a 1920 lynching in Texas bore the handwritten message, "This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left with a cross over it. Your son, Joe." The casual tone reveals how completely normalized these acts of terror had become within white communities, where the torture and murder of human beings was reduced to entertainment and social bonding. The psychological impact of witnessing such violence extended far beyond the immediate victims. Children who attended these spectacles grew up in communities where extreme racial violence was not only accepted but celebrated. The normalization of brutality created generations of Americans who viewed African Americans as less than human, perpetuating cycles of hatred that would poison the nation for decades to come. On May 15, 1916, the small city of Waco, Texas, became the site of one of the most horrific and well-documented lynchings in American history, an atrocity that would forever be known as the Waco Horror. The victim was Jesse Washington, a 17-year-old African-American laborer with mental disabilities who worked on a farm outside the city. Washington had been accused of murdering Lucy Fryer, the wife of his white employer, though the circumstances surrounding his confession remained deeply suspect. The evidence against Washington was circumstantial at best, and his alleged confession was obtained under questionable circumstances. Since he was illiterate and could neither read nor write, Washington signed his confession with an X, a document that was immediately published in all 3 Waco newspapers. The confession inflamed the already hostile white community, setting the stage for the barbaric spectacle that would follow. On the morning of May 15th, Washington was brought before a judge in a trial that lasted exactly 4 minutes. The jury deliberated for the same brief period before delivering their predetermined verdict: guilty. But the legal proceedings were merely a formality, a thin veneer of legitimacy masking what had already been planned as a public execution designed to terrorize the entire African American community. As soon as the verdict was announced, a mob of white citizens seized Washington from the courthouse. They chained him and began dragging him through the streets toward City Hall, where a massive crowd had already gathered in anticipation. The procession became a parade of cruelty, with spectators attacking Washington with knives, bricks, shovels, and clubs as he was pulled through the dust. Blood covered his body as the mob grew more frenzied with each passing block. By the time the procession reached the City Hall grounds, approximately 15,000 people had gathered to witness the execution. This represented nearly half of Waco's entire population, including men, women, and children from every level of society. The mayor and police chief stood among the crowd, making no effort to intervene as they watched American citizens prepare to torture and murder a teenager in broad daylight. The leaders of the mob threw Washington onto a pile of dry goods boxes that had been stacked beneath a large tree. They poured coal oil over his body while the crowd cheered and pressed closer for a better view. A chain was wrapped around Washington's neck and thrown over a sturdy limb, and several men joined together to jerk him into the air before lowering his body onto the combustible pile and igniting the flames. What followed was 2 hours of unimaginable brutality as Washington burned alive while the crowd celebrated. Spectators threw more fuel onto the fire to prolong his agony, cheering each time the flames rose higher. Children were lifted onto their parents' shoulders to get better views of the torture, while vendors moved through the crowd selling food and drinks as if this were a county fair rather than a human being's final moments. As Washington's body was consumed by the flames, members of the crowd began competing to claim pieces of him as trophies. His fingers were amputated and distributed as souvenirs, his fingernails carefully removed and saved as keepsakes. When dead in a cloth bag and dragged behind an automobile, flames finally died down, leaving only a charred torso. Even these remains were placed through the streets of downtown Waco. The procession continued to the nearby town of Robinson, where Washington's remains were hung from a pole in front of a blacksmith shop for public viewing. For hours, white residents filed past the gruesome display, many bringing their children to witness what they saw as justice served. Professional photographers documented every stage of the lynching, from Washington's dragging through the streets to the final display of his mutilated remains. The images from Washington's lynching were quickly transformed into postcards and sold throughout Texas and beyond. One photograph showed the massive crowd surrounding the burning pyre, their faces clearly visible as they smiled and pointed at the flames consuming a human being. Another captured children in the foreground, their innocent faces juxtaposed against the horror unfolding behind them. These postcards traveled through the United States mail system, carrying the message of white supremacist terror to communities across the nation. The casual distribution of these images demonstrated how completely normalized lynching had become within American society, where the torture and murder of African Americans was considered acceptable entertainment worthy of commemoration and sharing. The Waco horror represented more than just another lynching. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of white power designed to send a clear message to African Americans throughout Texas and beyond. The public nature of the event, the participation of thousands of spectators, and the involvement of local authorities all served to communicate that the law would not protect Black Americans from white violence. In the aftermath of Washington's murder, the African American community in Waco lived in a state of constant fear. Many families fled the city entirely, abandoning homes and businesses rather than risk becoming the next victims of white terror. Those who remained understood that any perceived slight, any sign of success or independence could mark them for similar treatment. The psychological trauma inflicted by the Waco horror extended far beyond the immediate community. News of the lynching spread throughout the South and beyond, serving as a warning to African Americans everywhere about the consequences of challenging white supremacy. The message was clear: no matter how young, how innocent, or how vulnerable you might be, white America reserved the right to torture and murder you with complete impunity. Yet decades later, the trauma of Washington's lynching continued to haunt the African American community of Waco in ways that revealed the lasting psychological wounds inflicted by racial terrorism. On May 11, 1953, a massive tornado tore through downtown Waco, killing 114 people and destroying most of the city center. In the aftermath of this natural disaster, a story began circulating within the Black community: that the tornado had followed the exact route over which Jesse Washington had been dragged 37 years earlier. Many African Americans in Waco interpreted the tornado as divine retribution, God's judgment upon a city that had celebrated the torture and murder of an innocent teenager. This belief provided the only sense of justice that Black residents had ever witnessed regarding Washington's lynching. No one had ever been prosecuted for his murder, no apologies had been offered, and no memorials had been erected to acknowledge the horror that had unfolded in broad daylight before thousands of witnesses. The connection between the tornado and Washington's lynching reveals how deeply embedded the trauma of racial terrorism had become within affected communities. For nearly 4 decades, the horror of that May afternoon had festered in the collective memory of Waco's African American residents, passed down through families as a warning about the dangers of existing while Black in America. This psychological scarring was not unique to Waco, but represented a pattern that extended across the entire South. Every lynching created ripple effects that terrorized entire communities for generations. Children who witnessed these atrocities grew up understanding that their lives held no value in the eyes of white society, that they could be tortured and murdered at any moment for any perceived transgression. The fear instilled by lynching campaigns forced millions of African Americans to flee the South during the first half of the 20th century in what became known as the Great Migration. Between 1916 and 1970, approximately 6 million Black Americans abandoned their ancestral homes seeking safety and opportunity in northern and western cities. This massive population shift fundamentally altered the demographic geography of America, creating large urban Black communities while simultaneously draining the South of its African American workforce. The economic motivations behind lynching became increasingly clear as investigators like Ida B. Wells documented case after case. Her research revealed that the majority of lynching victims were not accused of sexual crimes, as white supremacists claimed, but were targeted for economic success, political participation, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Successful black businessmen, landowners, and farmers were particularly vulnerable, as their prosperity challenged the racial hierarchy that white supremacists were determined to maintain. Wells discovered that many lynchings followed a predictable pattern. A black person would achieve some measure of success or independence, white competitors would feel threatened, tensions would escalate, and eventually a fabricated accusation would provide the excuse for murder. The 3 grocery store owners in Memphis fit this pattern perfectly, as did countless other victims whose only crime was refusing to accept the limitations that white society sought to impose upon them. The sexual mythology surrounding lynching served as a convenient justification for what was fundamentally an economic and political campaign of terrorism. By claiming that they were protecting white womanhood from black predators, lynchers could present themselves as defenders of virtue rather than murderers motivated by jealousy, greed, and hatred. This narrative allowed white communities to participate in or tolerate horrific violence while maintaining their self-image as moral and civilized people. Wells's investigation into the Memphis lynching revealed the hollowness of these justifications. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart were respected members of their community, family men with no history of violence or impropriety. Their murder had nothing to do with protecting anyone and everything to do with eliminating economic competition from successful black entrepreneurs. The courage required for Wells to conduct her investigations cannot be overstated. As a black woman in the post-Reconstruction South, she faced constant threats of violence and death. After publishing her findings about the Memphis lynching, a white mob destroyed her newspaper office and threatened to kill her if she ever returned to Tennessee. Wells was forced into exile, continuing her anti-lynching crusade from Chicago while living under the constant threat of assassination. Her work laid the foundation for what would become a national movement to combat lynching through documentation, publicity, and legislative advocacy. In 1909, Wells participated in the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, bringing her 2 decades of research and activism to what would become the premier civil rights organization in American history. The NAACP's anti-lynching campaign represented the first systematic effort to combat racial terrorism through organized resistance. The organization understood that lynching thrived in darkness and secrecy despite its public nature, because national media largely ignored or misrepresented these atrocities. By documenting lynchings, investigating their causes, and publicizing the truth about racial terrorism, the NAACP began to shift public opinion and create pressure for federal intervention. One of the NAACP's most powerful tactics was the deployment of investigators who would travel to lynching sites and gather evidence while local authorities were still celebrating their crimes. Walter White, the organization's assistant secretary, became legendary for his ability to infiltrate white communities and extract detailed information about lynchings. His fair skin and straight hair allowed him to pass as white, enabling him to attend Klan meetings and interview perpetrators who had no idea they were confessing their crimes to a black civil rights activist. Between 1918 and 1927, White investigated 41 lynchings, often at tremendous personal risk. His reports provided the NAACP with detailed documentation of the planning, execution, and aftermath of racial terrorism, evidence that was used to build public pressure for anti-lynching legislation and federal intervention. The organization's publicity campaigns transformed isolated local incidents into national scandals that could no longer be ignored by federal authorities or mainstream media. From 1920 to 1938, the NAACP flew a flag from their New York headquarters that bore the stark message, "A man was lynched yesterday." This simple but powerful statement forced Americans to confront the reality that racial terrorism was not a relic of the past, but an ongoing crisis that demanded immediate action. The NAACP's campaign began to achieve results as public opinion slowly shifted against lynching. Some Southern newspapers, recognizing that racial violence was damaging their region's economic prospects, began to oppose lynching on practical rather than moral grounds. The organization's efforts also attracted international attention, embarrassing American officials who were attempting to promote democracy abroad while tolerating domestic terrorism at home. The Jesse Washington lynching became a pivotal moment in this campaign when the NAACP used it to galvanize national and international opposition to lynching. The newly formed organization hired investigator Elizabeth Freeman to travel to Waco and gather evidence about the atrocity. Freeman's findings, combined with the professional photographs taken during Washington's torture and murder, provided the NAACP with powerful ammunition in their fight against racial terrorism. U.E.B. Du Bois, the editor of the NAACP's magazine The Crisis, devoted an entire 8-page supplement to Washington's lynching in the July 1916 issue. The supplement, titled The Waco Horror, combined Freeman's investigative reporting with the graphic photographs to create an unflinching documentation of American racial terrorism. Du Bois understood that the horror of Washington's murder, when properly documented and publicized, could serve as a catalyst for national action against lynching. The publication of The Waco Horror marked a turning point in the anti-lynching movement. For the first time, Americans outside the South were confronted with detailed evidence of the barbaric nature of racial terrorism. The graphic photographs and Freeman's meticulous reporting made it impossible to dismiss lynching as rough frontier justice or to maintain the fiction that these were spontaneous outbursts of righteous anger. The NAACP's strategy of transforming local atrocities into national scandals began to bear fruit as federal lawmakers introduced the first serious anti-lynching legislation in American history. In 1918, Republican Congressman Leonidas Dyer of Missouri introduced a bill that would make lynching a federal crime, punishable by imprisonment or death. The bill represented the first serious attempt to use federal power to combat racial terrorism, acknowledging that local and state authorities could not be trusted to protect African American citizens. The Dyer anti-lynching bill faced fierce opposition from Southern Democrats, who viewed it as an assault on states' rights and white supremacy. During congressional debates, Southern lawmakers openly defended lynching as necessary to maintain racial order, revealing the extent to which racial terrorism had been integrated into the political system of the South. Although the Dyer bill ultimately failed to become law, the national debate it generated represented a significant victory for the anti-lynching movement. For the first time, racial terrorism was being discussed in the halls of Congress, forcing American politicians to take public positions on whether the federal government had a responsibility to protect its citizens from domestic terrorism. The failure of federal anti-lynching legislation did not deter the NAACP from continuing their campaign. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the organization continued to investigate lynchings, publish their findings, and build public pressure for federal action. Their efforts gradually began to change the cultural and political landscape, making lynching increasingly difficult to justify or ignore. The organization's work also inspired local communities to resist racial terrorism through their own organizing efforts. Black churches, schools, and community organizations began to document lynchings in their areas, providing safe spaces for survivors to share their experiences and preserve the memory of victims who might otherwise be forgotten by history. Despite the courage and dedication of anti-lynching activists, racial terrorism continued to plague African American communities well into the modern era. The last documented lynching in American history occurred on March 21, 1981, when members of the United Klans of America murdered 19-year-old Michael Donald in Mobile, Alabama. The murder demonstrated the continuity between historical and contemporary white supremacist violence, revealing adapted to new circumstances. Donald's murder, that the ideology underlying lynching had not disappeared, but had simply followed the same pattern as thousands of lynchings that had preceded it. He was selected randomly, tortured, and hanged from a tree to send a message of terror to the African American community. The perpetrators believed they could commit this crime with impunity, just as their predecessors had done for nearly a century. However, the response to Donald's lynching revealed how much the legal and political landscape had changed since the height of the lynching era. Michael's mother, Beulah Mae Donald, working with civil rights attorney Morris Dees of the Southern Poverty Law Center, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the United Klans of America that sought to hold the organization financially responsible for her son's murder. The lawsuit represented a new strategy in combating white supremacist terrorism, one that targeted the organizations and ideology that motivated individual acts of violence rather than simply prosecuting the immediate perpetrators. The case resulted in a $7 million judgment against the United Klans of America, effectively bankrupting the organization and demonstrating that racial terrorism would no longer be tolerated by American society. The successful prosecution of Donald's killers and the civil lawsuit against the KKK marked a symbolic end to the era of lynching with impunity. For the first time in American history, white supremacists faced serious legal and financial consequences for racial terrorism, sending a clear message that the rule of law would be enforced regardless of the race of victims or perpetrators. Yet, even as legal victories mounted against organized white supremacist groups, the legacy of lynching continued to shape American society in profound ways. The trauma inflicted by decades of racial terrorism had created deep psychological wounds within African American communities that could not be healed by courtroom victories alone. The fear, mistrust, and vigilance that had been necessary for survival during the lynching era became embedded within Black culture, passed down through generations as both protective mechanisms and painful reminders of America's violent past. The wounds inflicted by America's campaign of racial terrorism run deeper than individual acts of violence. They carved scars into the very soul of our nation that remain visible today in patterns of segregation, economic inequality, and the persistent fear that haunts communities where lynching once reigned supreme. The memories passed down through families, the stories whispered in hushed tones, the warnings given to children about the dangers of existing while Black in America. These represent the enduring legacy of domestic terrorism that was allowed to flourish for nearly a century. Today, organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative work tirelessly to document and memorialize the thousands of lynching victims whose names were nearly lost to history. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, stands as a testament to their memory, its 805 suspended steel beams bearing the names of counties where racial terror lynchings occurred. Each beam represents not just statistics, but human lives cut short by hatred and fear. The lessons of this dark chapter demand our attention not as distant history, but as urgent warnings for our present moment. When we understand how ordinary citizens became complicit in extraordinary evil, when we recognize how institutional failures enabled systematic terrorism, we gain the tools necessary to prevent such atrocities from recurring. The voices of Jesse Washington, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, Will Stewart, and thousands of others call to us across the decades, demanding that we never forget, never ignore, and never again allow domestic terrorism to masquerade as justice in America.